Why China has never hosted the World Cup. It's about to change. China has never hosted the World Cup. And that is the most absurd sentence in sport. At Qatar, 2022, half of every football viewing hour on the entire planet came from one country, China. Not half of Asia, half of Earth. You heard that right, and not a single Chinese player was on that pitch. And that is just the beginning. Because the part that will actually blow your mind isn't the audience size. It's what China has been quietly building while everyone else was busy watching. But to understand why none of it has ever mattered to FIFA, you need to start with 2026. The wrong stadiums for the world's biggest tournament. Picture the 2026 World Cup, the biggest sporting event on Earth. 104 games, 48 nations, billions of people watching. Now picture where it's being played. MetLife Stadium in New Jersey, home of the New York Giants and the New York Jets. AT&T Stadium in Texas, built for American football, engineered for a completely different game. SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles, opened in 2020, cost $5.5 billion and was never once designed with a football pitch in mind. These are the venues the world is getting for the most watched tournament in human history. And here is the part most people never think about. When you retrofit an American football stadium for football, you cannot simply paint new lines on the grass. The problems run deeper than that. Running tracks, the kind used for athletics, sit between the crowd and the pitch in several of these venues, pushing fans 60, 70, sometimes 80 feet from the action. Think of it like watching a concert from the car park. You can see the stage, you can hear the music, but you cannot feel it. That feeling, the one that makes a World Cup match different from every other sporting event on the planet, is engineered out before a single ball is kicked. Then there are the roof lines. American football stadiums are built for a narrower field of play. The sight lines, the angles, the roof is designed to frame are wrong for a full-width football pitch. Corner seats become bad seats. The geometry quietly works against the sport it's supposed to be hosting. Now here is the brutal catch. America is not doing this because it doesn't care. The United States has produced some of the most commercially sophisticated stadiums on the planet. These are buildings that generate $300, $400, sometimes $500 million a year in non-match day revenue alone. That is more than the GDP of some small island nations. They are financial machines, ruthlessly profitable, optimized to the last seat. But they are optimized for the wrong sport. And that distinction, commercial asset versus purpose-built cathedral, is the fault line this entire story runs along. Because while America has spent decades perfecting the stadium as a revenue vehicle, another country has been doing something almost nobody in the Western football world has paused to notice: not building bigger. Not just spending more, building differently. Building as if the stadium itself is the message. Not one of them, not two. Not a single prestige project funded once and photographed forever. Each one more structurally extreme than the last. Each one borrowing engineering solutions from aerospace, from offshore oil extraction, from bullet train technology. Each one sitting largely empty, waiting for a tournament that keeps going somewhere else. And the first one you are about to hear described will make every converted NFL stadium on Earth feel like it belongs to a different century. The Cathedrals, Part 1. Start with a flower. Not a photograph of a flower, not a flower-shaped logo pressed onto a facade. A stadium that blooms. 28 steel petals, each one parametrically engineered, each one curving outward and upward in a sequence that makes the entire structure look like it is opening toward the sky. That is the Hangzhou Olympic Sports Center. And the first thing you need to know about it is not what it looks like. It is what it weighs. The Bird's Nest in Beijing, arguably the most famous stadium on Earth, used 42,000 tons of steel to build its interwoven shell. 42,000 tons. For context, that is roughly the weight of 30,000 family cars stacked on top of each other. The Hangzhou Stadium uses 67% less, not because it is smaller or simpler. Because the architects designed the outer shell and the inner bowl to share structural loads at every single level the way a spine and a rib cage work together, each one reinforcing the other, neither one carrying the weight alone. The result looks more ambitious than anything that came before it and weighs a fraction of what it should. Now here is the part that puts everything into perspective. That is just the first one. Move south to Guangzhou and you find the Greater Bay Area Sports Center. The roofline here is drawn from the hull of a Song Dynasty ship, curved, sweeping, borrowed from a 1,200-year-old design. And that curve is not decorative, it is functional. The geometry of the hull shape creates passive airflow around and through the structure, cooling 60,000 people without a single mechanical system running overhead. No industrial air conditioning units, no cooling towers. The shape of the building does the work, from groundbreaking to handover. The whole structure was completed in under 2 years, using prefabrication techniques and parallel construction work streams that most Western project managers cannot replicate within their planning and procurement frameworks. Then there is Kai Tak. You may know that name. It was the airport in Hong Kong where jumbo jets once threaded between skyscrapers at rooftop height on final approach, one of the most technically demanding landing procedures in commercial aviation history. That runway is now gone. And on the exact footprint where those jets once touched down, a stadium sits on 800 seabed piles driven into the harbor bed. 800 individual foundations, each one anchored in water. Above them, a 4,800-ton retractable roof, roughly the weight of 3,000 mid-size cars, closes completely in under 30 minutes against typhoon-force winds. And then Chengdu. The retractable roof at the Fenghuangshan Stadium does not run on wheels or rails. It runs on magnetic levitation, tracks the same technology that lifts China's bullet trains off the ground at 350 kilometers per hour. Wrapped around the outside, 77,000 individually programmable aluminum panels cover the entire structure. At night, every one of them is lit. The stadium does not glow. It becomes a lantern, visible from across the city. 4 buildings. 4 completely different engineering philosophies, each one solving a problem that Western stadium design has not yet thought to ask. But as extraordinary as those 4 are, they are still not the ones that will stop you cold. The next chapter is where the architecture stops making sense by any standard you currently hold. The Cathedrals Part 2. Most countries build 1 landmark stadium per generation. 1. The project that defines an era, anchors a city's identity, gets photographed for the next 50 years. Britain had Wembley. Germany had the Allianz Arena. Australia had Stadium Australia. 1 per generation. That is the global standard. China built 4 more. Start at the edge of the country Dalian, in the northeast, where the Yellow Sea pushes against the land on 3 sides. The Suoyuan Stadium doesn't sit near the water. It sits in it. Sea on 3 sides, the building rising from the coastline like something that grew there rather than was constructed. The facade is ETFE, a polymer film more commonly used in offshore oil rigs, engineered to survive salt air, high winds, and sustained marine exposure. The panels ripple, they mimic the motion of a wave. And rising from the perimeter of the entire structure, a double helix public ramp spirals 1 full mile to a rooftop platform overlooking the bay. 1 mile of continuous ramp. That is roughly 16 city blocks of elevation climb, built not for maintenance access, not for emergency evacuation, but purely for the public to walk up and look out. Now here is what most people get wrong about that detail. It is not an architectural flourish. It is a philosophical statement. The building is saying something. It is saying the stadium does not belong to the event. It belongs to the city. Move inland to Shenzhen. The Universiade Center rises 213 feet, roughly the height of a 20-story building in crystalline glass triangles. Each triangle is a structural panel. Together they form a roofline that fractures incoming sunlight into shifting geometric patterns across the interior. By day, the building catches light and breaks it apart. By night, it glows from within, the triangles illuminated in sequence. The acoustic engineering required to prevent that geometry from turning the interior into an echo chamber involves some of the most complex sound modeling work ever done on a stadium project. Because a glass triangle is not just a design choice, it is a surface that reflects sound the way a mirror reflects light. Getting 60,000 voices to land cleanly rather than bounce endlessly required solutions borrowed from concert hall acoustics, scaled up by a factor that had never been attempted before. Then Qingdao. The youth football stadium was built from marine-grade oil rig steel, the same specification used for deep-sea extraction platforms in the North Sea. Airport runway drainage technology runs beneath the pitch, clearing standing water at a rate that would handle a tropical downpour without delaying a game by a single minute. The facade carries 110,000 individual LED point sources, embedded invisibly into a wave-shaped surface, so that when they are off, you see the architecture. And when they are on, the entire building transforms into something that has no comparison in stadium design. All of it built from an empty plot in under 3 years. And then you come back to where it all started, the bird's nest. 42,000 tons of interwoven steel, each beam load-bearing, each beam structural, so that you cannot separate the facade from the frame because they are the same thing. The building holds 91,000 people and is engineered to withstand a major earthquake while every single one of them is inside. It was built for the 2008 Olympics. And here is the detail that engineers don't want to admit: it still has no serious rival for structural ambition anywhere in the world. Almost 2 decades later. That is not sentiment. That is just an honest read of what came after it. But the bird's nest matters for a reason beyond its own engineering. It matters because it gave China permission to believe that a stadium could be a civilizational statement rather than a commercial asset. Every lotus petal, every magnetic levitation track, every oil rig facade, every double helix ramp on this entire list points back to 2008. As the moment Chinese infrastructure decided it would lead the global conversation, not join it. 8 buildings, 1 philosophy, 0 World Cups hosted. And here is what makes that last fact so staggering. It is not because China wasn't ready. It is because the game that decides who hosts has never been played on a football pitch. And the philosophy behind that game is darker and more fascinating than anything you have heard so far. 2 philosophies. 1 verdict. Let's be honest about something before we go any further. America is not bad at building stadiums. You need to hear that clearly, because the easy version of this story is a sneer. Walk into SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles. Really walk in. $5.5 billion of engineering, a retractable roof, a translucent ceiling that floods the interior with natural light, a playing surface that can be reconfigured in under 24 hours. AT&T Stadium in Arlington pioneered the stadium as venue concept, hosting the Super Bowl, international boxing, college graduations, and a Monster Jam rally in the same calendar year. MetLife Stadium generates revenue figures that European club owners study like scripture. These are not failures of ambition. They are extraordinary achievements of a very specific kind. The kind where the stadium serves the business. And that is the fork in the road. In America, every design decision flows from one upstream question. How do we maximize revenue per square foot? The seat configuration, the concourse width, the sightline compromise, the naming rights facade, all of it traces back to that single question, and the answers it produces are brilliant. They are just produced for a different sport, in a different context, toward a completely different goal. Now here is the part that changes how you see every chapter that came before this one. China does not ask that question. China asks a different one entirely. What should this building say about us in 200 years? That is not an exaggeration. It is the actual design brief. The Hangzhou lotus petals are not there because they tested well in focus groups. The Dalian double helix ramp is not there because it drives premium hospitality revenue. The Chengdu magnetic levitation roof is not there because a sponsor paid for it. They are there because the building is a statement, and the statement is being made to history, not to a quarterly earnings call. Think of it like the difference between a fitted suit and a school uniform. The World Cup is not a commercial event that happens to involve football. It is a cultural event of a scale so total that the venues become part of the memory. You do not remember that Germany 2006 happened. You remember standing in Dortmund with 65,000 people when Klose scored. The building is inseparable from the moment. When the geometry is wrong, when you are 80 feet from the pitch, when the roofline was drawn for a different sport, the moment is diminished in ways no broadcast camera can fully rescue. America's stadiums will host a financially extraordinary World Cup in 2026. FIFA will be delighted. The commercial numbers will break records, and not one of those venues will have been built for the sport being played inside it. China's 8 cathedrals were all built for exactly that sport, and every single one of them will sit empty while the tournament happens somewhere else. But what you still don't know, what almost nobody talks about openly, is why. And the answer sits inside one of the most politically layered stories in modern sport. Why the greatest host never hosted. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you ran FIFA, if you held the keys to the most financially powerful sporting organization on earth, and one country accounted for half your global digital audience, had the most extraordinary stadium portfolio ever assembled, and had a president publicly declaring his dream of hosting since 2011, would you give that country the World Cup? For decades, the answer was no, and the reasons why will change the way you see how global sport actually works. Start with the rule that sounds neutral, but never quite was. After Qatar hosted in 2022, FIFA's continental rotation framework meant no Asian nation could bid immediately after. The door closed before China could step through it. Not because China failed to bid, because the calendar moved against it. But then came the part nobody expected. China didn't panic. China didn't scramble. China read the rotation timeline years in advance and made a cold, deliberate calculation to use the 2030 bid not as a serious campaign, but as a rehearsal. A live exercise in mapping FIFA's internal terrain, building relationships inside the voting blocks, identifying exactly which doors needed opening and who held the keys. Most nations burn everything on a single bid. China filed the intelligence and waited. And that patience ran straight into a wall. Because here is the part nobody talks about openly. FIFA's voting structure is not a neutral democracy. It is a coalition of confederations carrying different weights, different allegiances, different histories. And the relationship between China and Western voting blocs has carried a geopolitical friction for 2 decades. That does not politely stay outside the boardroom door, just because the agenda item is a sports tournament. China's national team gave critics a convenient sporting argument to place in front of the political one. 1 World Cup appearance, 3 losses, 0 goals scored, an awkward headline for a prospective host. Never mind that the United States hosted in 1994 without having qualified for the previous tournament. The standard applied to China was never quite the standard applied to everyone else. And for a long time, that was enough to hold the door shut. For the 2026 World Cup, a tournament China has no team in FIFA sought between $250 and $300 million for Chinese broadcast rights alone. That figure is larger than the entire broadcasting deal FIFA signed with several European nations who had actual teams in the competition. You heard that right. And here is what that number actually means. FIFA's financial architecture, the revenue model that funds the entire organization, pays out prize money, supports development programs across 211 member associations, has become structurally dependent on a market it spent decades declining to fully embrace. China is not a growth opportunity for FIFA anymore. China is load-bearing. Remove it and the model doesn't slow down, it cracks. At Qatar 2022, you had half of Earth's football attention flowing from a single country that wasn't even in the tournament. Take every viewer in Europe, every viewer in South America, every viewer in Africa, every viewer in North America, combine all of them, and China matched that number almost exactly on its own. Now, here is the part that blows people's minds. The expansion of the World Cup to 48 teams was not purely a sporting decision. A 48-team tournament requires more stadiums, more transport capacity, more hotel inventory than any previous edition in history. Only a handful of countries on Earth can deliver that at scale on a fixed deadline. China is one of them. In fact, China may be the only country that can do it without a single temporary structure or a single converted venue. The expanded format was the mechanism, the Chinese market was the motivation, and the bid that followed was the inevitable conclusion of a financial logic FIFA had been building toward for years, whether it admitted it publicly or not. And so, the vote came. And the cathedrals that had been sitting empty, the lotus flower, the ship hull, the seabed piles, the magnetic levitation roof, the double helix ramp, the crystalline glass, the oil rig wave, the bird's nest itself finally got their answer. But what that answer actually changes for China, for football, and for every assumption you hold about where this sport is going is the part nobody has fully reckoned with yet. The last warm-up act. Here is the honest truth about 2034. China's national team will almost certainly not be good enough to win the World Cup they are hosting. The decades of underinvestment in grassroots development, the failed foreign star experiment, the qualification record that still makes uncomfortable reading, none of that disappears because a tournament arrives on home soil. China knows it. The people planning this event are not operating under the illusion that hosting produces champions. They are operating under a different calculation entirely. Because here is what hosting the World Cup actually does. Not to the team on the pitch, but to the country holding it. It moves the center of gravity. In 1994, America hosted with a team that hadn't qualified for the previous tournament. 20 years later, Major League Soccer was one of the fastest-growing leagues on Earth. Not because hosting made them instantly competitive, because hosting made football real to an entire generation who watched it live and decided they wanted to play. China already has 300 million registered players. The audience is there. The infrastructure is there. The financial weight is there. What China doesn't have yet is the moment. 2034 is that moment. And what it signals is the completion of a shift 30 years in the making. Global football's commercial center of gravity, moving permanently from west to east. Hosting doesn't create that shift. It confirms it. In front of 5 billion people. The 2026 World Cup will be the last time this tournament is played in buildings never designed for it. The last time the sport's greatest stage is handed to venues that were engineered for a different game, in a different country, for a different crowd. Every host nation after China will be measured against what China delivers. That is not a prediction. That is already the standard being set. After that comes China. And the buildings are already standing, already lit, already waiting. The World Cup is just finally catching up.